Yep. I'm live. He's telling me I'm not live. Am I ready? What does that mean? What does this mean? Not ready. I don't know, watch enough of baseball. Does that mean we're ready? God, okay. Well, welcome to everyone who's here tonight, and I'm told that there are a lot of people who say they're watching that they're streaming it tonight, so we welcome all those who are streaming as well as those of us who are here tonight. So I want to welcome our speakers. Some people are not hearing. I don't know what those waves mean, so you're not hearing me. Now we are. Okay, so I have to get right up here like the singers and all those people. Yes. Okay. Well, we're glad to have you all here anyway, and we're glad to have Dan and Roger with us. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to them both. I'll talk to you first about Dan since he's going to speak first tonight. But Dan Shaule is registered with the Garden River Ojibwe Nation. He currently resides on Georgina Island, First Nation, and he wrote his master's thesis on treaties in Ontario, and he spent the last 25 years researching and advising on Indigenous history for large-scale cases involving the Aboriginal land claims and treaty rights. He's currently the professor of Indigenous Studies at Seneca and Durham College. So we welcome you, Dan. Now I'm going to introduce Roger at the same time. Roger, I'm delighted actually to have Roger and Cindy here tonight. We've known each other for a long time, and we were all part of St. John's Presbyterian Church in Toronto for a number of years. Roger is the founding partner of OKT, and I'm not sure that stands for Althias what?
Clear Townshend.
Didn't get it.
Althias Clear Townshend.
Okay, the second one? Clear Townshend, okay. He's practiced Aboriginal rights, constitutional human rights, administrative law, and at present he's primarily litigating a land claim for First Nations and is lead counsel in a lengthy trial involving a claim to Aboriginal title to portions of the beds of the Great Lakes. So I think that's very interesting. Rogers appeared in courts of appeal of Ontario, British Columbia, and Newfoundland, so that's right across the country, and the Federal Court of Appeal, and also the Supreme Court of Canada. So we're honored to have you with us tonight, Roger, and we're looking forward to hearing from both of you. Thanks very much. You're on, Dan.
All right. Hello, thank you. You can hear me? Perfect. I'm going to set my timer. All right. Can we have the second slide? So we've seen most of this. My family comes from Garden River. I recently had a couple articles published on treaties. I've been doing research, and I'm a professor, and in the part-time, I play lacrosse twice a week, and in the summer, I do weekend tournaments. So I'm not young anymore, so I do a lot of running, and I stay fairly healthy. But other things that aren't on this list, are not on this list, or is that some of the other sort of personal things, whereas I am a 60 scoop survivor. I am a cancer survivor, and a whole list of other things. But for me, my role has been, my identity has been a researcher and working on treaties for the last 20, 25 years or more. I was born into a small family, not a small family, a family of 7. I'm the youngest. My mother happened to marry somebody from Georgina Island. So everybody knows Georgina Island is in the southern tip of Lake Simcoe. So we spent our summers on the island, and we lived in Toronto. Now, I just want to tell you a bit of a story as way of introduction. And that's a story about a guy by the name of George Henry Howard. George Henry Howard is from the Hiawatha First Nation, which is south of Peterborough. And he went out fishing in 1986. And he was in the Treaty 20 area, which was made in 1818, which protected their hunting and fishing rights. And he was fishing, and the conservation officer arrested him for fishing out of season. And so he went to court, and the court had decided that he was guilty of fishing in his territory. And the reason why they decided he was guilty of fishing in his treaty territory that didn't abrogate hunting and fishing rights, because the court had come to the conclusion that the Williams Treaty's basket clause re-surrendered the 1818 treaty. Now, that's not going to mean anything to you at this moment in time, but in the next 20 minutes, you're going to go, oh, that's what he meant. But this was a Supreme Court of Canada decision in 1994, which decided that the basket clause had re-surrendered all of the treaty territory. Can we go to the next slide? Is there one before that one? Is there one after that one? Can we go back? Is there another one before this one? No? Okay. There's one that says July 18th, 1924. Maybe not. Okay, so July 18th, 1924, there in the House of Commons, there was a quote, and I wouldn't lie to you people, because we've known each other for so long, but I'm pretty sure it's on my slide somewhere. But on July the 18th of 1924, there's a Governor General warrant for a surrender of area to 10,719 square miles. And this is the Governor General asking for payment for the Treaty Commission that just got this surrender to this 10,719 square miles. And how this all came about was the federal government had approached the province of Ontario to make an agreement so that they can enter into a treaty with the Mississaugas and the Chippewas of this territory. And that agreement, the federal council and the province's council agreed to this agreement, and they took it to the Governor General. The Governor General was the one that signed off on the whole agreement, and then that was then what the commissioners, the treaty commissioners, were going to, that was their mandate. Now, why do we need a treaty? Because the Royal Proclamation says that Indian lands will be acquired by treaty. So the Royal Proclamation of 1763 creates this standard where the British were going to get land from quote-unquote Indians by treaty, by cession of land by treaty. Now, part of what happens around this time of the treaty is that the Constitution Act of 1867 has two sections. One section of the Constitution, Section 9124, means that the federal government has responsibility for Indians. Section 109 says all lands, once surrendered, belong to the province of Ontario. So the trick here is that the federal government can create reserves, has responsible for Indians, and can make treaties, but they don't have any land because all the land in the province is given over to the province. They become the official owner of the land. So as you can see, because of the Royal Proclamation, Ontario is covered by treaties. And all of the different colors on this map that you can see are different treaties that cover Ontario. Beginning in, I think it's 1781, right up to 1923. There are a few exceptions, though. Some of those are the 1850 treaties, where some of the treaty members say they didn't show up for the treaty. Nowadays, the Crown doesn't concern themselves with that. They said, well, you know, we made a treaty with everybody else. Just because you didn't show up doesn't mean there isn't a treaty. We left some treaty annuities, and you happened to pick them up. So by your subsequent conduct of picking up those treaty annuities, you actually agreed to the treaty. And there's a few instances of that. And then there's the other one that Roger's going to be talking about, that although the Royal Proclamation says all lands belong to the First Nations, have to be surrendered before they're used, one area of land that has never been covered by a treaty are lands underwater. Next slide. Oh, here's my, here's the July 18th, 1924 I wanted to show you. See where it says 10,719 square miles. So this, July 18th, 1924, is the Indian Department, who knows the treaty is for 10,719 square miles, asking everybody in the House of Commons, letting them all know that the treaty was for 10,718 square miles, and then publishing it. And so it should be common knowledge that the treaty is only for 10,718 square miles. And I know I'm repeating myself in the sense that I keep saying 10,718 square miles, but it'll make sense very shortly. Next slide, please. This is the just covering Southern Ontario. And everybody can see the blue section to the west of Lake Simcoe. I don't want to look behind me. That's Treaty 16. So we are currently in the Treaty 16 territory. And this is the hunting and fishing territory of the Mississaugas and the Chippewa. And so they were approached by the British to surrender this territory. So the idea being that they can create a road to get to Penetang. I don't know much else about Treaty 16 other than who signed it and what the sort of known overt purpose is for. And I've done some research. There isn't much written about Treaty 16. But Treaty 16 is now interpreted to be part of the Williams Treaties. Yes. There is a 3-volume book that you can actually go onto chapters, and they're called Indians and Treaties in Canada. And show of hands, who thinks there's less than 50 treaties in Canada? Less than 100? Okay, we have some movement. Less than 200. More, little more confidence. Less than 300. 400? Roger knows. He's going to ace the test. And I'm going to get this number wrong, but I believe it's 486 treaties that cover Canada. If you can believe that. There's 486 treaties that cover Canada. And these are the ones that are covering the southern part of Ontario. And where this begins in 1869, when the hunting land claims, when the Mississaugas and the Chippewa claim the hunting territory above the 45th parallel. So on the map, you can see the area that's not colored. That is the area claimed by the Mississaugas and the Chippewas. And so they claim that this area is specifically not covered by a treaty and is their hunting and fishing territory, and so they want to get a surrender of it. So because this treaty is, because this petition begins in 1869, 2 years after the Constitution, this means the federal government has to approach the province. And what the federal government wants is the province, to give them $125,000, and so they can put it in a bank account, and the interest will pay annuities to the Mississaugas and the Chippewas. At this time, they haven't gotten into a fight about if they can use some land to create a reserve. That comes later on with a case called St. Catharines Milling. But for our purposes, by 1884, a surveyor in the Indian Department by the name of Sam Bray, he goes out and does a survey of that area that's not covered by a treaty, and he comes up with the number of acres that's in that area to be 10,719 square miles. Now, when the federal government approached the province says, oh, that's interesting. We're going to do some research, so put the claim into abeyance. So from 1869 basically to 1921 or so, the claim is in abeyance, and the province will always say, we'll look into it and we'll get back to you. And at one point, around 1880, the province actually says that we're not responsible for treaty payments. It said we were given this land at Confederation. So why would we have to pay for land that's been given to us? If you want to get payment, you have to go back to the old province of Canada. And that stays their position to the 1920s. This is a lot of information, so I'm trying to slow it down a bit. So, John A. Macdonald in 1888 sends the Mississauga and Chippewa claim to a board of arbitration. John A. Macdonald's kind of getting sick and tired of hearing from the Mississaugas and the Chippewas because they are actively pursuing their claim. And the Mississauga and the Chippewa know how to approach different levels of government. They understand the Ministry of Justice, the Indian Department, the Governor General, and they're sort of well-versed in contacting these people, and they're tired, and they're kind of getting tired of it. And so John A. Macdonald sends it to a board of arbitration. So from 1888 until 1895, the case sits in the board of arbitration. Now, the Board of Arbitration is set up to look at treaties that have been made and annuities that have not been paid. The Mississauga and Chippewas claim is to area that has not been covered by a treaty. So they basically waste 7 years sending it to this Board of Arbitration. The Board of Arbitration eventually writes back to the Indian Department and says, this is not a proper claim. Why is it not a proper claim? Because the land hasn't been ceded. And the Indian Department had confirmed this back in 1870. And the Board of Arbitration advises them, you well know that this land is open for negotiations between Ontario and Canada, and the First Nations themselves have asked you for a treaty. So all three parties should just make a treaty. Instead, the Indian Department asks for the file to be sent back to the Indian Department. They said, Board of Arbitration, can you send all the file and all the paperwork back to us? And it does that. The Indian Department then creates an internal review committee made up of a guy by the name of Reimer and McKenna. And they look at this. They look at this paperwork, and part of the paperwork was that the Board of Arbitration said this claim is not a proper one for us because it's for land not covered by a treaty. We only look at treaties that have been made and annuities that haven't been paid. So Reimer and McKenna half quote that, and in their final report they said the Mississauga and the Chippewa claim isn't a proper one, as the counsel for the Board of Arbitration said, and we agree with it, so we're going to dismiss the claim. And so from 1880 to 1900, when the McKenna-Reimer report comes out, they've wasted another 12 years of the Mississauga and the Chippewa land claim. The Mississauga and the Chippewa don't take this lightly. By 1903, they decide to hire lawyers. And although they've hired lawyers, they've actually gone to the Indian Department themselves and did some research at the Indian Department archives. The lawyers just get stonewalled. They can't get anywhere with the Indian Department. The Indian Department doesn't want to hear from them at all. The Indian Department asserts that they were doing all that's necessary for the Indians and legal interference is not needed. This is when the Indian Department creates some social policies. They say that you Indians can't give money to each other to hire lawyers. This just becomes social policy. They say Indians can't meet in groups to discuss land claims. And again, they just insinuate Indians can't hire lawyers. The lawyers eventually get discouraged. And those that don't get discouraged and walk away, they literally get hired by the Indian Department. One such lawyer is a guy by the name of Sinclair, R.V. Sinclair, who did work for the Mississaugas and the Chippewas, but ended up working for the Indian Department. And the Indian Department in 1914 asked him, actually, the Justice Department asked him to review the claim before the Indian Department for the Mississaugas and the Chippewa. And he reviewed the claim, and he said, well, they have a valid claim. He said, the Indian Department knew it was valid, the province knows it's valid, the province just keeps putting it into abeyance, but it's actually just a hair smaller than what we'd think. Up at the very top left corner, where the French River comes out into Georgian Bay, there's a small overlap there with the 1850 treaty. He said, so it's not 10,719 square miles, it's 9,700 square miles. So not a big difference. But he said it's a valid treaty and its value is incalculable. He finished his report in 1916. The Indian Department paid the invoice, didn't ask for a copy of the report, and then World War I broke out. At the end of the war in 1921, the Justice Department finally was able to schedule a meeting with the Indian Department. At this point, the claim had been ongoing and deemed valid for 50 years. The only real holdup was the province continually refused to loan some of their lands, and I'm going to try to say this with a straight face. The province had to loan some of their lands so the First Nations could surrender the land and they could create a reserve for them. I'm trying to say this with a straight face, but also the province was expected to give $125,000, $130,000 to be put into a capital account, and that interest used to pay annuities. The land was being used by the province of Ontario in violation of the Royal Proclamation. But at this point in time, by 1921, they needed a surrender. But the federal crown's mindset had been that the province will never agree to loan some of their land to create reserves and give this money for a capital account. I'm going to move this along a little fast because the time is going short. The federal government eventually invited the province to investigate the extent and validity of the Mississauga and the Chippewa claim. And this was a softball way to get the province involved in the claim and then get them to seemingly agree to these two conditions, that they would loan the federal government some land and give them some money for annuities. The extent and validity had been known for 50 years, so this was kind of a no-brainer. But it did get the province involved in the claim, and the province eventually did agree to the two terms. Long story short, the Justice Department negotiated an agreement between Ontario and Canada. And this agreement was that the 10,719 square miles that we can see here, not covered by a treaty, would be surrendered. And they appointed 3 commissioners: an Angus Williams, a lawyer with the Indian Department, Uriah McFadden, a provincial lawyer from Sault Ste. Marie, and R.V. Sinclair, a provincial lawyer. R.V. Sinclair, who had just years earlier decided that they had a valid claim, was now going to be on a committee to investigate the extent and validity of their claim. The investigation of validity was an interesting process. The commissioners and the secretary went out. They had a 10 by 10 foot map on it. That map had outlined in red the area I have up here on the map, that's blank. The preliminary research showed that that area clearly was not covered by a treaty, but the treaty commissioners were also discovered that the north shore of Lake Ontario, on the map, it's the 1787 treaty, is a supposed treaty. It doesn't actually exist. It was invalidated months after it wasn't even negotiated. It just didn't exist. What happened was in 1787, there was a plan. They only needed a little bit of land, but they said, well, these Indians can't read or write, so we'll just go get a little surrender. We'll describe in the whole area, and the plan will just be to get the whole area surrendered, and then they won't know the difference because they can't read. And the commissioners knew that because there's letters talking about the plan. So what's interesting here is that they would bring the map The first meeting actually took place on Georgina Island. And they brought this 10-foot map and put it on the wall, and they said, where do you fish and hunt? Up in this area, and it was outlined in red on the map. And they said, oh yeah, we hunt and fish up there. They said, but we also go down south. We go down the Holland River, and then we actually end up on the north shore of Lake Ontario. And they said, do you know that it's not covered by a valid treaty? And the commissioner's like, oh really? We've never heard that before. That's very interesting. So they leave, and they go to the next community, put the map on the wall. And the people go, oh yeah, we've hunted and fished up in that area. And they said, we also go down the Otonabee River and we end up on the north shore of Lake Ontario. And did you know that that area is not covered by a valid treaty? And the commissioners go, really? We've never heard that before. They go to the next community. They put the wall on the map. Have you hunted and fished in this red area? And they said, yes. They said, but we also go down to Lake Ontario. And did you know that that area is not covered by a treaty? And the treaty commissioner said, no, we've never heard that before. That is so interesting. We know this because they kept 284 pages of minutes. And by the time they got to the last community, they were just mad. They're like, we're not talking about anything outside of the red line. We want to hear about the red line, and that's that. So they validated the treaty, they went back out, and they got a surrender. The surrender itself, Clause 1, covers 17,600 square miles, which covers all of that area at the top, but the pink portion, it covers that area too, because that pink portion, that treaty was supposed to be in 1818, which was supposed to go to the 1818. The northern part of that treaty was supposed to be the 45th parallel, which they thought was at the tip of Lake Simcoe. But by 1923, they discovered that the 45th parallel is much farther north. And so it becomes a gray area. And so they also discovered that south of Lake Simcoe, there's that other area that's not covered by a treaty, was another area that was not covered by a treaty, very specifically by Simcoe. And so they had to report that, and of course the 1787 treaty. So the treaty commissioners included a basket clause, and they said, at this point in time, you surrender 17,600 square miles, 21,600 square miles, and you also surrender any claim that you ever had, now have, or will ever have. So Treaty 16 is a claim they ever had. So that's why I say Treaty 16 is part of the 1923 Williams Treaties, because it was re-surrendered in 1923. But then we come back to the July 18th, 1923. A year after the treaty was signed, the government is still thinking, the Indian Department is telling the House of Commons that the Governor General understands the treaty to be for 10,719 square miles. Also, along the way, the treaty commissioners tell the newspapers that they're there to get a treaty to 10,719 square miles. And in the annual reports of the Indian Department, they say the treaty is for 10,719 square miles. And so the commissioner's mandate is 10,719 square miles. All of their reporting is for 10,719 square miles. But when Howard gets caught fishing in 1986, the Crown argues in court that the Williams Treaty has a basket clause, and that basket clause re-surrendered other treaty territories. Whew, I timed that up pretty good, didn't I? So can we go to the next slide? So this is the one letter. At the bottom of the first paragraph is the important part where the Indian Department is just telling you that legal interference is not appreciated or needed, or I think he used desired. Next slide. This is the newspaper article that shows that the Crown only wanted the 10,719 square miles. Next slide. This is the annual reports of the Indian Department in March of 1924. Again, the Indian Department reporting that they got a treaty from the Mississauga and the Chippewa the year earlier to 10,719 square miles. And there may be one more after this. Oh, no. This was just some terms I thought we would discuss. But in 1994, the Supreme Court of Canada looked at the Williams Treaty and said they validated the land clauses and ignored all the other clauses in the treaty. And so that is the Williams Treaty. So all of the treaties in Southern Ontario that any Mississauga or Chippewa made are interpreted as being re-surrendered by the Williams Treaties. The end. Do you want to ask a couple questions now or wait till after Roger presents?
I've got a microphone. I have a microphone here for questions. We thought we might wait till after Roger if people can hold their questions. Unless there's...
Good evening. I'll start by acknowledging the territory, which is a custom of Indigenous people. And this is the territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island, the Minjikaning First Nation, and the Beausoleil First Nation. Dan has talked about a number of treaties, and I'm going to talk about a few more treaties, all in the relatively fairly close to here. But to say a little bit more about treaties in general, just to introduce it, when Europeans arrived, of course, Indigenous people were here. They had stable and thriving ways of life and ways of governing themselves and protecting their territories from outsiders. Was a custom pretty well everywhere that if you were going to someone's territory, you asked permission to be there if you weren't part of that group. There was also, generally speaking, a very strong spiritual connection to their territories, and they felt and still feel a very strong spiritual responsibility to care for their territories. And that's a lot of what Indigenous claims are about. It's about their connection with the land, and it's about their responsibility for the land. Now, Dan talked about this a little. A British policy was when they were, when European settlers were beginning to move into the land, Britain would make treaties with the Indigenous people in the area before, generally speaking, the land was occupied by settlers. Now that was a practical and military necessity in the 18th century. The British just couldn't have held the territory without the cooperation, or at very least the acquiescence of Indigenous people. And the British officers admitted that in the 18th century. Things changed in the 19th century. The British took a much more paternalistic and unilateral approach to land and sovereignty. So generally, there's a divergence in understanding what treaties are about. The Crown thinks they're about sale of land, when you get some money for it and maybe have some reserved land set aside. Most Indigenous people, it's a matter of sharing resources, sharing governance of the territory, and having a continuing relationship with the Crown. So those two divergences about what treaties are. So I want to move to, and as Dan pointed out, there are many, many treaties across Canada, and they all have different histories, very different histories. But I'm going to talk about the treaty just to the west of the ones that Dan was talking about. And that's with the Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation, whose reserves are on the Saugeen or Bruce Peninsula. So we talk of them collectively as San, which is Saugeen Ojibwa Nation, refers to those two Anishinaabe First Nations. And in the 18th and first part of the 19th century, they were really one unit. They were a fishing people. The waters were at least as important to them as the dry land. And the whole light part of the territory on this slide is what they consider to be their traditional territory. Now there are some issues about the edges of it, and if you've got sharp eyes and a good memory, you'll see these aren't exactly the same as the boundaries on some of the maps that Dan was using. And there is certainly, in the eastern part of the territory, there's shared territory between the Saugeen Ojibwa and the First Nations in this area, Georgina Island and Jickaning and Beausoleil. That's clear. There's also, in the south, there's some shared territory with Aamjiwnaang First Nation and Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. And about 10 years ago, there was they had a formal agreement about that, saying this is our shared territory. So what happened in 1836, European settlers were starting to move into the territories of San. And the Crown came to them and said, well, you've got this territory, but settlers are starting to move on to it, whether you like it or not. And we can't stop them. We can't keep them out. So what we'll do is you agree to stay north of Owen Sound and let us have the rest. So that's the light green area in the middle. And they very reluctantly agree to that in return for the promise from the Crown that the Crown would protect the peninsula for them from the encroachments of the whites forever. Well, forever turned out to be 18 years. And at that point, the Crown again came to them with the same story. Settlers are, and this would be the yellow part of on the map. Settlers are starting to move into your territory, into the peninsula. We can't stop them. If you do nothing, they're just going to overrun the peninsula. So surrender the peninsula, and we'll protect these much smaller areas, these little red bits you see, the reserves. So after a very long and talks about that, and went back and forth for years, but finally, at one meeting in October of 1854, about 1 o'clock in the morning, they finally managed to get an agreement from the Saugeen Ojibwa for that. And that would see the peninsula. We're getting something happening to the graphic here. Oh, that's me. So that would see that yellow part opened up for settlement, and the red portions kept. The next day, the Crown negotiator writes to the sheriff and says, "We just got a surrender of the peninsula. Be sure to keep settlers off." He just did the very thing he spent years telling the Saugeen Ojibwa they couldn't do. And as soon as they got what he wants, then he can do it. So when I saw that, I thought that's just wrong. That's deceit. And that was the beginning of this claim that we started in 1993. So that's the treaty side, and that's in relation to the yellow part of that map. The other thing I should point out is what didn't happen to their chart. You'll see there are a few other colors in the map if you have sharp eyes. There were some other smaller treaties in there. I think you probably they almost vanish in this map. But the part of their territory that's never been touched by treaties is the water. All of the treaties ended at the water's edge. Probably because the Crown just thought, they just didn't think of it that way. But to the Great Lakes Anishinaabe, they're fishing people. That's their livelihood. That's as much their territory as the dry land. So that's why we also came, well, here's territory. There's never been a treaty. There should be Aboriginal title to those parts of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. So those two parts of the case that I worked on for almost 30 years now. What was sought in relation to the water is a declaration of Aboriginal title. For the Treaty 72 area, that yellow area, we're seeking land back that's still in the hands of government. There was a decision made not to try to seek land that's in the hands of private parties who've paid for it. But land's in the hands of government. We're seeking that land, and compensation for land that can't be returned, and compensation for lack of use, loss of use. So that came to trial. And we had a trial that lasted 18 months. And the last bits of it were on Zoom because we were in the middle of a pandemic. And at that trial, the evidence we called was a blend of traditional knowledge holders. We had experts, academic experts in history, anthropology, in archaeology, in linguistics, in legal history, in military history, covering in much more detail what I've just outlined for you generally happened. So the results of that trial were not good news for my clients. The court did not find Aboriginal title to the lakes, although it did find that they were historically present in the 17th and 18th century, which was in fact contested by the Crown. The court also saw there was extensive fishing use and control of fishing. And one other thing about the Saugeen Ojibwa is they had already established commercial fishing rights. And they have exclusive commercial fishing rights to pretty well all of the water territory that's shown up there. But the court did not find that they met the test for Aboriginal title, which is exclusive occupation at the assertion of British sovereignty, which in this case, everyone had agreed would be taken to be 1763. And the court, in fact, suggested that it just wouldn't be possible to have Aboriginal title to the beds of navigable waters, because that's sort of beyond legal imagination, because they thought that would conflict with public rights of navigation, as if there weren't some ways that those things could be reconciled, it being one or the other altogether. But there was a failure of imagination there. On the treaty side, the court did find there was indeed a treaty promised in 1836 to protect the peninsula, and that promise was breached. The Crown could and should have done more to protect the land. However, the court did not find a breach of fiduciary duty, which was a key legal remedy we were seeking, and that's really getting into a fairly detailed legal doctrine, so I'm not going to explain it, but a lot about it. That was just a sort of a step of how you deal with, how you get to the remedies you want. So there is an appeal pending. We're expecting it to be heard in the spring of 2023, and some of the things that are at issue in it are Anishinaabe perspectives and the role that plays in the legal test for Aboriginal title and the interpretation of evidence. The concept of land and water being one in Anishinaabe thought. The idea of control of resources as opposed to control of territory, whether those are the same thing or a different thing. And also a legal doctrinal question about fiduciary duty. So those are my presentation, and so I guess both of us can take what questions you'd like. Okay.
If there's any questions for Dan or Roger, I'd be happy to bring the microphone over to you.
Dan had mentioned that at one point the Indians were not allowed to hire lawyers or assemble to contest things. So, Roger, obviously that changed. Do you know when that happened and why it happened?
The section of the Indian Act, it was first enacted in 1927, said that. Before 1927, there were still all kinds of ways that the government generally made it virtually impossible for First Nations to hire lawyers. That changed in 1951 when that was removed from the Indian Act. But there were many years after that practically speaking, First Nations just generally didn't have the capacity after being held down that long. It took some time to rebuild their capacity to hire lawyers. I mean, lawyers can be expensive. So, and that was part of the evidence in the case I was talking about it. And one of the things that the judge did find in favor of the Saugeen Ojibwa was that they didn't, waste a lot of time. Sort of pretty well as soon as they were able to bring a court case, they did, and that was in the 1990s.
One of the things that happens in the 1920s is that after World War I, a lot of indigenous people end up in Europe, and they end up having their own money, being treated as equals, and having all these rights. So when they come back in the 1920s, they start making petitions for land. They start opposing residential schools. They start opposing health. They're arguing for better housing. They're starting a political party. And they negotiated, and they discovered that the Williams Treaties is a bad deal for them. And so the Justice Department and the Indian Department is hearing all of these concerns coming from First Nations people, who are all the products of the first waves of residential schools who could speak and read English. And so what do they do with all of these concerns that are brought before them? They make a law saying you can't hire lawyers to bring these concerns to us.
My name is Bryce Miller. My great-grandfather was B.B. Miller, and he was a mayor of Wyerton, and I believe he was an Indian land agent as well. I'm curious, how would he have gotten that to become that? What kind of election, or would it be just an appointment?
I'm sorry, I had trouble. Maybe
Okay.
you're muffled.
I started off by saying my name is Bryce Miller, and my great-grandfather was B.B. Miller, Bryce Burgess Miller, and he was, I believe, the first Rev of Wyerton, and he was also Indian land agent. How would he get that part of his designation?
How did he become Indian agent? Indian land agent. Yeah. That was a position that was sought after. After treaties were made and lands were sold, there would need to be people to act as agents to sell the land. So that was a sought-after position. There would be some money involved in doing that, and how that happened, I don't know the specifics. It's usually people would make a pitch and someone would get it. Oh, it was not elected, no.
So, Roger, you said about that that for the indigenous people, the treaties meant that they were going to share their land, their culture, and that it was a sharing experience. For the Canadian government, it was a matter of buying land and paying money for it. Because of the way things have gone, is there any way that switched at all? Do you see our government at all trying to take the place of the indigenous people, saying that this is about sharing and culture and so on? And are the indigenous people saying, no, we want our land back and you got to pay for it? I'm just curious.
I see how you can. I see how that has some traction to it. The rhetoric of government is certainly very nice and soft and fuzzy, but it doesn't go much beyond rhetoric. When indigenous people say land back, well, different groups mean different things by that. There are many groups, when they're talking about land, what they want is a say in how the land is managed, not that they're trying to boot everybody else off it. Do you?
I do have a little comment. Yeah, we're at a changing pace where hopefully we can get back to both sides recognizing that we're sharing land. Now, in Roger's trial, Ontario actually argued that they don't have any responsibility for any wrongdoings during treaties prior to 1964. I think it was 1964, 1963. But if you go to the Ontario government's website, it says, oh, well, we love reconciliation and we love our Indians and we're making all this, But if we've done anything wrong before 1964, don't come to us. And so I take that as a mixed message from them, that they're just sort of saying nice things but meaning something else. And I say this because the actual deputy minister for treaty negotiations has a condo in my building, and he knows my thoughts. And we have to ride in the elevator every so often. So we talk, we're friends, but I've called them out on this sort of thing in a nice way. But I have a house on Georgian Island, but I have a place downtown so I could work.
Yeah, I have two questions, if I'm allowed to. The first one is, and I didn't know whether you were referring to just one of the treaties or whether this is the Indigenous position on all the treaties, but you had mentioned that the Indigenous people were looking for not all the lands back, but only those lands still owned by the government, none that were sold. Was that strictly the peninsula that you were talking about?
Yes. Different Indigenous groups have different positions about things like that. So it's very hard to make generalizations about treaties. I made a few at the very beginning, some general comments, but the detail, the level of detail you're talking about, I can only answer piece by piece.
And then my second question was also around the peninsula. You had said, and I guess I didn't catch who was from the government that was asking this, when they told the Indigenous people that we can't keep the settlers out. Who was that said that? The Ontario government?
There wasn't an Ontario government at that time. The first time in 1836, that was Lieutenant Governor Bondhead, at which time there was, in 1836, there was an Upper Canada and Lower Canada. And in 1854, when they came back and said the same thing, that was Lawrence Oliphant, who is the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. And at that point, it wasn't Upper and Lower Canada, it was Canada East and Canada West of the United Province of Canada. But all this was, Ontario as such didn't exist until 1867, Confederation.
And then following through to that next part of the story that you told, next part of the history that you told us, you said that once the 1854 treaty was, or when he got his way, Oliphant got his way, that he then did stop the settlers from coming in, and what was the purpose of that? Why did he stop the settlers? Was it to keep the land for himself, or for the... Like you said, he was deceitful, and he had always told the Indigenous people, we can't keep the settlers out, but then he did keep the settlers out. What was his reasoning for keeping his I presume it was a greedy reason, but why did he keep the settlers out at that point?
That's not completely clear. I mean, maybe we can have some speculation on it. I mean, I think it would affect the land sales, if there were settlers on it, it would make it much harder to sell. So the land was sold by auction. And if there was someone there, well, the auction wouldn't work so well. But you know, was there something about, did Oliphant himself benefit from keeping them settlers off? I don't know. I'm not sure. I think Dan has some thoughts.
I have many thoughts about Lawrence Oliphant. I've read and written a lot about him. But I think Lawrence was saying that the encroachment by non-Indigenous was just too much and they couldn't keep them out, which I can say this, but Roger probably can't. I don't believe that at all. I don't think there was any great number of people going to the peninsula that necessitated a treaty. However, Oliphant, he was an aristocrat and he was a world player, and he needed some appointment, and he needed to do something spectacular to be appointed to go to the Crimea War. He wanted a diplomatic appointment to Crimea. So if he got a surrender, and his idea of the surrender, stop me if I'm going too far, Roger, is that he had made a plan that if he sold all the land in the peninsula, this would fund the Indian Department. So that was his plan, to fund the Indian Department by the sale of all the land. But I don't believe the people going onto that land was there, because even today there's big parcels of land on the peninsula that have never been sold. And so that's why those parcels, the SON wants those ones back. That land reverted back to them. But I've done extensive research on that, and I don't believe that there was a mass migration of non-Indigenous people onto the peninsula to pressure them to get a surrender.
There were lots of trees on the Bruce Peninsula, and that was money, and they certainly were cutting it at a fierce rate. So I would think that that would be some of the reason why they wanted to control it, so if people came, then they wouldn't get all the money. There was a lot of shenanigans that happened there that wasn't very honorable, I don't think.
I'm going to ask you to pardon some of my ignorance, but in general, would the idea of not having to pay taxes, Indigenous people not having to pay taxes, would that be an essential component of almost all of these treaties, that would have been an underlying principle, that there would not be taxation or something like that? Like, I'm wondering where that principle comes from. Is it from the treaties themselves?
I'm not. There are different ways of answering. I mean, where it comes from legally is the Indian Act. I can't think of a treaty that there might have been a few that explicitly talked about taxation, but I think in the early years it was. I mean, taxation wasn't a thing. It was only in the First World War that we started getting income tax. Before that, the government raised their revenues by customs and excise tax, and yes, I mean, and for example, the Jay Treaty, which was between Britain and the United States, did provide that Indigenous people could go take their goods back and forth across the border without paying duty on it. So yes, and that has, in fact, that the Jay Treaty, in my view, has been incorporated into some treaties with First Nations who are on the border. I don't want to get too much details in that. This is sort of client confidential stuff.
What I've sort of come across is that there's 2 points to negotiating. There's the Indigenous people who negotiate, and there's the non-Indigenous who negotiate. And so I think it's the prairie treaties. During the numbered treaties, there's 11 numbered treaties that cover the prairies. At one point, they were in a bit of a stalemate. And so the Crown really wanted to wrap things up and get a treaty. And so the Crown, coming from its perspective, and I think Jill St. Germain has this in her book on treaties, is that the Crown, at the very 11th hour when things were falling apart, they said, oh, if you sign this treaty, there'll be no taxes for you. And that means everything to them, but it didn't actually mean much to the First Nation. But it is in the Indian Act. But just to clarify, non-taxation for registered Indians is only applicable on the First Nation. It's not widespread throughout the treaty territory. It's only within this. It's only available to be used on the First Nation.
Yeah, there are lots of taxes that Indigenous people do pay. The exemptions is really mostly income tax, I guess, and sometimes and for property that's purchased on reserve and used on reserve. But yeah, lots of Indigenous people pay lots of taxes. It's a myth that no Indigenous people pay tax at all. There's lots of that.
I'm wondering if you can say something about parts of Canada that were never under treaty until very recently. And are there still parts of Canada that no treaty applies to specifically?
Oh, certainly. Most of British Columbia does not have treaties, and there were virtually none until recently. And then I don't remember the dates, but maybe 20 years ago there was a treaty with the Nisga'a. In the territories, there were no treaties until started about the 1980s, I guess. And in Quebec, there weren't treaties until the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975. Other than little bits here and there. But yes, there are large parts of Canada with treaties that are, within 30 or 40 years old, and a lot of parts of Canada where there just still are no treaties, and they're still either trying to negotiate them, or they're litigating them, or they're not doing anything.
So just for clarification, I'm correct that on lands that there are no treaties, the Indigenous people have an even stronger case. Is that correct? Or is that a matter of interpretation?
Well, legally, yes. But I mean, you would think that nothing much could happen in BC without Indigenous consent, but that's not what's happening.
Up until the 1970s, the British Columbia just thought that if if you weren't a contributor to the economy, you couldn't have a land claim. That's just a conceptual idea, and one they held on to very tightly.
We've heard in recent years about the doctrine of discovery, which suggests, as I understand it, that settlers had a kind of natural right to claim lands. And now, are we saying that the lands that are not covered by treaty are considered crown land? And how does that link with the doctrine of discovery? Like, my sense is the doctrine of discovery seemed to have more to do with some countries than others. Did it affect British settlers also? Or the attitude of the British coming to Canada?
It's broader than that. When Europeans discovered North America, there were theological debates about what had to happen. And you had, 15th century Spanish theologians arguing back and forth about whether you had to treat indigenous people pretty much as human or not. And sort of out of that came, various pronouncements from the Vatican about how to treat indigenous people. And that has become the doctrine of discovery. Now that was then picked up by United States courts in the 19th century. And there are debates about what the doctrine of discovery means. Does it mean if one European nation discovers some land that as against it and other European nations, it has the primacy, or does it give rights over the land itself and the indigenous people who are there? And there are debates on both sides of that. So yeah, and you'll see that's why there are moves, right now, to have the Pope revoke some of these encyclicals that were passed, hundreds of years ago, because they're the foundation of Europeans just moving in and thinking, it's ours. If we discover the land, it's ours. And there's sort of the international law that you can get territory can become belong to a nation by a number of ways, by conquest, by treaty, or by discovery. And discovery is really supposed to just mean when there's nobody there, not when you discover a country with people there. It wasn't intended for that, but sometimes it's been applied that way.
Yeah, you've opened up a can of worms. There's a lot of great resources on this. I think the Robert Williams wrote The American Indian and Western Legal Thought, and there's another book called Conquest by Law. But basically, the Pope had just said, when we see another person who is non-Christian, we can claim their land, and they live under our domain. And if they disagree to live under our domain, then they become perpetual enemies of the state, and then we can just take their land and kill them. And that idea generally flows through. Now, the French and the British in North America just portrayed indigenous people as backwards and listless and having no land territory. They just walked around in circles. And that suited them for their purpose of acquiring their resources and their lands. Whereas the Spanish to the south actually recognized indigenous people, but because you recognize them as human beings to a certain degree, you could actually wage wars with them and then kill them and take their land. And so these are very separate things. And so in the 1821-23 Marshall decisions, the Marshall said, The discovery of the European nations gave them the land that they discovered. Now, the word gave is the essential part there, whereas the doctrine of discovery should say that the discovering nation has the ability to treaty those lands from those indigenous nations. So it's all on how you're going to interpret it. But it's an interesting idea that comes out of 800 years of crusades and the 7 founding nations of Europe traveling farther and running into people that they've never seen before. And if they're people, if they have 2 feet and a heartbeat, but they're non-Christian, are they really human? And that becomes the question. And if they're not human, can they own land? And if they don't own land, then we can just take it. Can of worms.
Thank you, Dan and Roger, for your insight, your sharing the history of the treaties, and your continuous work, standing in front, sharing information, and continue to share the story. Thank you. And thank you very much for in-person folks attended all 3 sessions, and folks online, thank you very much for the participating, and we conclude our speaker series on Indigenous studies. Thank you.